y'all. Welcome to episode 31 of the Growing Space podcast, and happy belated Earth Day. Earth Day was yesterday, and the whole month of April is Earth Month, which I just love that there is a dedicated month to celebrating our Mother Earth. But, to be totally fair, we should be celebrating our mother every single day and just expressing our immense gratitude for all of the life and well-being that she supports for us, and taking time to nurture her and love her because she does so much. And I don't know about you, but I really love our little home here. So anyway, happy belated Earth Day. I hope you find some time this week to get your hands in the soil and just appreciate Mother Earth. Maybe stand barefoot in your yard or in a patch of grass near you and just embrace Mother Earth. Today's episode, I'm going to run through 10 quick tips for growing food successfully in the summer in containers. So being that it is nearly the end of April, which is just honestly mind-blowing to me. But given that it is nearing the end of April, this is the perfect time if you live in the Southeast, as I do. For those of you who are brand new to listening to this podcast, hello, welcome. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, so I am in the USDA Hardiness Zone 8A. Which means I can start planting my tomatoes and all of my other summer veggies starting mid to late April, early mid-May. All of those timings are perfect for planting the things that produce a flower and then a fruit from that flower. So your tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, eggplant, okra. Basil is an herb that absolutely loves growing in the summertime. There's lots of exciting things to be planting right now. For those of you who are listening who are growing mainly in pots or containers, so true small space food growers, this episode is really going to speak to you and helping to set you up for success for growing these edible plants in containers this summer and helping to manage some of the stress that the summer season can bring for our plants. So that's what I have in store for you today. I'm really excited to share these tips with you. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Growing Space podcast. I'm your host, Farmer Erin, owner of the Patio Farmer, and I believe that no matter what size space you have, you can grow food at home. Tune in every Tuesday as I share my best tips, tricks, and encouragement for tending to homegrown edible plants. I'm here to support your food growing journey. The Growing Space podcast is sponsored by Plant Club by the Patio Farmer. Plant Club by the Patio Farmer is a monthly subscription service I started in 2020. It's a membership-based opportunity to take your growing journey to the next level. With 4 different membership options, you get to decide the amount and kind of support that's right for you. All Plant Club members receive access to my online community through a platform called Circle. Having access to this platform allows members to share pictures, ask questions, celebrate harvests, and get to know each other. All Plant Club members also have access to free seeds each month, along with information on how to plant and tend to their crops, with seeding instructions and downloadable resources from the Patio Farmers Resource Library. Membership starts at just $14 a month. Join Plant Club today by visiting my website, thepatiofarmer.com/membership. Before I jump in and talk through these 10 tips, these are going to be 10 quick tips, don't worry. 10 quick tips for planting summer vegetables and growing summer vegetables in containers. I do just want to preface that when you are growing food in containers, this is a confined area. We're growing things in pots or in containers that have defined limitations. They have defined structure. They have a defined volume of soil that they can hold to support our plants, and they have a defined spacing for our plants as well. So they are a contained, a specialized form of growing food. And as such, there are things to keep in mind, some variables rather that you are in control of as the grower, more so than if you were growing directly in the ground or even in a raised bed. So when you're growing in pots and containers, it is super important that you just understand the nuances of growing in containers, especially as we inch towards summer. Here in the Carolinas, it feels like we're already in summer. Last week, we had days that were close to 90 degrees, and it was just insane. Love Mother Earth. Take care of her, please. But, there are just some nuances and special things to keep in mind as we are growing in contained spaces, in small spaces. And so I just wanted to give that kind of context and framing for our conversation today. All right. So the first tip for growing summer vegetables in containers and being successful as you do, it starts with choosing the right container. Several of these tips are going to speak towards this, but the first tip that I would like to share with you is that the bigger the container that you choose to grow in, the better off you will be for several reasons. First, it's going to give you more flexibility in terms of what you can grow. So a lot of our summer vegetables, they take up a lot of space. Looking at you, tomato, looking at you, cucumber. I don't know if you've seen these plants grow before, but they can get quite massive. So making sure that you choose a large container that's going to give you the space that you need, both in the soil and around the plants, to grow your summer vegetables in particular. And then a larger container is also going to give you more flexibility in other seasons to really maximize that space that you have allocated. Another reason why you might consider choosing a bigger container versus a smaller container is the fact that the more soil volume a container holds for you, then the more moisture and more water retention capabilities your soil will have. In other words, the bigger the container you have, the less often you will need to be watering in the summer. And we'll talk a little bit more about watering as we walk through these tips. But, if you have a small container, you're probably going to be watering at least once a day. You might even find that you need to do 2 times a day. If you have a larger container, and when I say larger, I mean like a 10-gallon size container. So if you think about 2 5-gallon buckets worth of soil volume, a container like that, you can easily just water once a day, even during the dog days of summer. So that's your first tip, is to choose a bigger container. The bigger, the better, especially in the summertime. Number 2, there is absolutely no such thing as too much sunlight for your plants. Now, this is something that I go into a good bit in my masterclass. And if you're interested in learning all about sunlight, how to predict which spaces that you have available to grow food will get the most sunlight, and other considerations for how to plan your space according to the sun and how much sunlight you get, or even the orientation of your space and how it receives sunlight, then I would encourage you to consider signing up for my masterclass. That is one of the main course modules. The first main module of my masterclass, called the 6 S's to Success, is sun. And I will put the link to my masterclass, the 6 S's to Success, in today's show notes for you to take a gander at. So you're looking at 8+ hours per day of direct sun. So pick your sunniest spot. That's where you want to put your summer veg. Number 3, third tip for growing food in containers in the summer is to choose a non-porous container, especially if you are dealing with a space that gets a lot of heat. What are some examples of non-porous container materials? There is plastic, which I know people are a little apprehensive about growing in plastic. I totally understand. Microplastics are a thing. So if you're okay with growing in plastic, plastic makes a great container option, especially in terms of moisture control. So the reason why we want to choose non-porous containers specifically for our summer vegetables is because porous containers are able to lose moisture, and moisture is our best defense against the stress of the summer heat, right? Whereas a plastic container, or you could use a metal container. There's a lot of non-toxic metal options out there. Even like a glazed ceramic would be non-porous because that glazing helps to seal those ceramic pores. But choosing a container made out of those materials is going to help hold in and lock in moisture much longer than, say, a terracotta pot or, some kind of unglazed ceramic. I am a huge fan of growing food in grow bags, which are like fabric bags, heavy duty bags with handles. And I love these grow bags, but I'm super mindful about them when I use them in the summertime because of their propensity to lose moisture to evaporation. So I don't use grow bags in areas where I know I have a lot of heat stress, and I try to like nestle them in with other things so that they have some support and resilience. So choosing a non-porous container for your summer vegetables is tip number 3. Kind of going along with the idea of container selection with tip number 4 is to add a saucer to the bottom of your container or use a self-watering container. This tip kind of goes back to the heat management idea and helping to keep your plants as supported as possible with moisture throughout the summer season. Drainage in your containers is super duper important. Just because we're trying to hold in moisture does not mean that we should not have drainage holes in all of our pots, or at least have an opportunity for excess water to flow out of the bottom of your container. That is super important. One of my biggest pet peeves, and I have like no idea why containers even exist that don't have holes at the bottom, is one of my biggest pet peeves, is when I go to buy a container and I look at the bottom of it, I'm like, oh my gosh, you don't have hole. Like now I have to drill a hole in you. I don't really want to drill a hole in you, but I will because I love my plants. So make sure that your containers do have holes in the bottom so that water is able to freely evacuate the container. But then adding a saucer to the bottom of your pot can be really helpful, again, with that moisture retention. Now, there are some containers out there that are, quote unquote, self-watering. And I have kind of mixed opinions on these. And I'll kind of walk you through just a high level perspective. So these self-watering containers can be really helpful if your space gets a lot of direct sun and a lot of heat, or you might be traveling if you take weekend trips in the summertime, or sometimes it just makes life easier, especially if you're growing on a patio or on a balcony and you don't really want a lot of moisture leaving the container. You're worried about staining, or you want to just try to keep moisture off of like a wooden surface like a deck. Then self-watering containers can be super helpful. A self-watering container is a container that has a false bottom on it. So it still has drainage holes in it that sits on top of a solid bottom, which is the true bottom of the pot. And then you put your soil in the main part of the container with the false bottom. You plant, and then as you water, that water is collected in that reservoir for the roots. Very important. The roots to take advantage of later on. Self-watering containers can be really effective. They help to store and hold water for you as your plants are growing. Your roots are going to benefit most from that once your plants are pretty mature. The first month or two that you have things planted, that self-watering reservoir may not be as beneficial or helpful to you as it will be in the second and third months that your summer veggies are growing. But it definitely helps to provide some insulation against the heat and reduce the amount of watering you'll need to do, once we get towards the dog days of summer, July, August, all of that. One of my apprehensions with using self-watering containers is that you have that false bottom. It's like pseudo drainage, but sometimes that reservoir can fill up and then hold standing water that's not used by your plants, which can sometimes lead to other issues. So just be mindful if you're using a self-watering container. If your soil is having trouble drying out, you may need to water less often. If we get some really heavy rains, you may need to water less often. A great kind of test to do to see if you do need to water is to take your index finger and stick it down in the soil as far as possible. If the tip of your finger is dry, then you need to water. If the tip of your finger is like kind of moist or really wet when you pull it out of the soil, then you can skip watering for that day. So just something to call out, be mindful of those self-watering containers. They can be really helpful and really great, but you may need to tweak your watering practice accordingly. So that's tip number 4. Now for tip number 5, and this speaks to watering. This is a continuation of watering practices. One of the best practices as you're watering, especially your summer vegetables, is to water in the morning or the evening. And the main reason why you would want to water during the cooler parts of the day is for the better retention and uptake of water for your plants and their root systems. So you want to think about watering the soil around the base of the plant versus the plant itself. Most of the moisture that our plants take in is taken up through the roots versus through the leaves, although their leaves can take in some moisture as well. So just consider watering at the base of the plant and around it versus over top, and watering in the morning or in the evening. Now, there is some debate out there as to which one is better, watering in the morning or in the evening. For me and my space, it doesn't really matter. I usually water in the morning, but I could totally water in the evening, and I have watered in the evening and not had any issues. If your space is more susceptible to slug damage, snails, little crawly, soft-bellied buggos that might be on the move at nighttime, then I would encourage you to try watering in the morning versus in the evening. There are also some people who say that watering in the morning is better, especially in the summertime, at warding off fungal disease and other pest issues because the leaves are not wet while it's cool and dark out. But I say, generally speaking, morning or the evening is best for water retention. You don't want to be watering your plants in the middle of the day because those little water droplets can actually act as magnifying glasses from the sun to your plant's leaves and can burn them ever so slightly. So it's just best practice to water when it's cooler out for all of those reasons. Moving right along to number 6, this tip is, again, a way of reducing evaporation and retaining moisture. And my tip here is to plant densely. Now, I do want to just qualify that statement because I am someone who is a strong proponent, a strong believer that you can definitely overcrowd your plants, and you don't want to do that, especially in the summertime. But there is something to be said about layering the sizes of your plants and helping to create an environment that is locking moisture into the soil. So a happy medium for planting densely would be not to have just one plant growing in one pot. There is some planning and some intentionality that needs to go in with how you are structuring and setting up your pots. But let's just give an example for a tomato, okay? So if you have a large pot, let's say it's a 10-gallon pot, that is technically enough room to plant 2 tomato plants. That's going to give you enough soil volume to support the root systems of 2 tomato plants. But tomatoes also need 2 to 3 feet of space between one another for full maximum production and health and vitality through the summer. So sometimes you could have a container that's going to give you the right amount of soil volume for multiple large plants, but only the spacing or provide the distance between one plant to another for one plant. Okay. This is also something else that I go into a lot of detail in my masterclass, the 6 S's to Success, when I talk about the second S, which is space. But let's just say we have a 10-gallon pot and we put a tomato plant in there. If we were to leave that tomato plant alone in its 10-gallon pot, it would grow. It would be totally happy and healthy, but you're going to lose a lot more water to evaporation because that soil is going to be exposed. If we were to plant a basil plant in that pot with our tomato, basils are smaller, shorter plants than tomatoes, so you can pair them up nicely in the same pot. But let's say we put a basil in there, maybe we put some green onion, also a nice petite plant, throw in a couple of marigolds for a pop of color. Maybe we sow some lettuce like right underneath the tomato, or we pop in 1 or 2 Swiss chard. Now we have a responsibly planted and spaced container that is densely planted as well, with one plant, one main center plant, which is our tomato, which is going to grow super tall and big and lush. And then we have a lot of smaller plants, which are also companion plants to tomatoes, that will help to reduce pest issues and not compete with those resources for the tomato. And we're able to hold in moisture in our container, and we're growing a lot more things. I mean, that's like 5 or 6 different crops that I just named that can go in the same pot with your tomato and really help to maximize your growing space as well, even if you're growing in containers. So that is the next tip, to just think about planting densely, but mindfully and with intention as you do. So the 7th tip for growing summer veggies in containers is to consider your vertical space. Now, a lot of our summer vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, pole beans, sometimes even peppers and eggplant, they like to vine, or they do vine. And so having a trellis or an opportunity for those plants to grow vertically can be really helpful. Now, you can get creative with this, not to sound like a broken record, but I do talk about vertical space planning a lot in my masterclass as well. So check the show notes for the link to my masterclass, the 6 S's to Success. But vertical space can be a really helpful tool for growing happy, healthy summer vegetables. So these are plants, our summer vegetables are plants that unfortunately are really susceptible to fungal disease and pest issues, and they produce really heavy fruit that sometimes need additional supports. So as we're growing vertically, we are able to increase the airflow and access to sunlight for our plants and all around our plants, which is going to help keep them healthy. The sunlight is a fantastic disinfectant, in addition to providing our plants with all of the delicious energy that they need to grow and thrive. It also helps to keep our plants nice and clean. Airflow and ventilation helps to whisk away any fungal spores or make our undersides of our plants' leaves less hospitable to bugs. Yeah. So vertical space, keep that in mind. If you're growing on a patio or a deck or a balcony, you can think creatively, and maybe you have an existing structure that you could ask your plants to grow up, like deck railing or a balcony railing. You can also use hanging baskets. I really am obsessed with the idea of growing vining vegetables in hanging baskets and asking them to grow over the edge of the basket and then hang down. Could you be growing cherry tomatoes in a hanging basket, supporting them vertically and increasing airflow? Could you be using a fence or a trellis or a deck railing to help support vertical growth on your plants and helping to keep them in direct airflow and full access to sunlight all around the plant as they grow? Not only is that good for pest and disease management, but it will also increase your harvests and your yields. So consider your vertical space. Tip number 8 for growing happy, healthy summer veggies in containers is to be sure that you are choosing the right plants for the time of year. One more little plug for the masterclass. I do talk about seasons. Our season is the 4th S to success. And I go into a lot of detail about how to choose crops and how to plan for the season that we are in. So, like I mentioned already in this episode, the things that like to grow in the summertime here in the Southeast. This may be different depending on where you live in the world or in the US. Shout out to any international listeners to this podcast. Here in Charlotte, North Carolina, our summer season, our summer planting season starts about mid-April and goes through July 4th. That's really the latest for planting any summer vegetables would be the 4th of July. And things that like to grow in the summer, that like the heat, that need the heat, and more importantly, they need the direct sunlight, 8 to 10 plus hours of direct sunlight, are going to be the things that produce a flower and then a fruit from that flower. So your tomatoes, your cucumbers, eggplant, squash, zucchini, winter squash, as well as summer squash. So summer squash is your zucchini is too, zucchini too. And like your yellow crookneck, your patty pan. Winter squash are going to be squashes that have a hard outer rind. So your butternuts, your spaghettis, your delicatas, your buttercups, butternut, acorn, all of those we think of harvesting in September, October, but they actually need to be planted in the summertime. Melons are also a great summer vegetable, plant, fruit, etc. Green beans do well in the summertime here, pole beans or bush beans. Let's see, okra, peppers, tomatillos, ground cherries. All of those are beautiful summer vegetables. And then we can also plant basil in the summertime. Basil loves the summer heat. So that's an option, as well as lots of other herbs. Pretty much any herb except for cilantro you can plant in the summertime here. If you want to learn more about the different summer plant families, I would encourage you to go back an episode or two and listen to the continuation of my Meet the Plant Family mini-series. I just did a whole episode on the Cucurbitaceae plant family, which includes squash, melon, and cucumbers. And then 3 weeks ago, I did an episode on the Solanaceae plant family, which includes tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, potatoes, ground cherries, etc. So go back and listen to those if you're really interested in growing some of those summery fruits, vegetables this season. But it is really important that you plant with the season. We're getting there, y'all. Tip number 9 is to avoid radiant heat. So if you're growing in small spaces and you may have your pots or your plants somewhere maybe that's close to a structure like your home or a shed or a deck on pavement even, or on concrete, on a concrete slab, just be conscientious of the fact that any hardscape can hold heat and then radiate that heat back to your plants, which if they're close by, it can increase your heat stress on your plants. If your space is limited and the best you can do is growing right up next to your home, if your home is made of brick or is a dark color, then that will amplify the radiant heat that may be bounced back onto your plants. So just being aware of those hard surfaces and any sources of radiant heat to help just keep your plants as insulated as possible. If you do have sources of radiant heat, you may find that you need to water more. And going back to some of those earlier tips of choosing a larger container, watering in the morning or evening, Maybe if your space gets a lot of heat, you would be a good candidate for a self-watering pot. Some other things to do to put a buffer in between your plants and a source of radiant heat is to not keep your plants right up against that source. So if it's a wall or some kind of vertical structure, maybe you pull your plants away from that structure 2 or 3 feet to give some airflow to rinse away some of that heat in the middle of summer. If your source of radiant heat is coming from below, you could get even a 4 or 6 inch tall plant stand. Again, you're increasing that airflow, that space between your pot, your plants, and the source of radiant heat below. The 10th tip for growing summer vegetables successfully in containers is to feed your plants on a monthly basis. Now, I will give you my recommendation for feeding your vegetables, and that is to use a dry granular plant food. I will share a couple of recommendations that I have for you in today's show notes, so be sure to take a look there. But whenever you are growing in containers, going back to the beginning of this episode, when I was framing it up and telling you or just reminding you that that space is limited, so are the nutrients available to your plants. And as they're growing and thriving and producing big fruits that you're going to be harvesting, that requires a lot of energy and a lot of nutrients, a lot of support from your soil. So even if you start off with a great high quality potting soil, which you absolutely should do, as your plants are growing throughout the season, which takes a couple of months, right? They will benefit greatly from having some plant food added. Now, I like using dry granular plant food because it lingers in the soil a little longer than a liquid plant food, which I appreciate, especially since I have so many plants. So using a dry granular plant food is something that you would need to do on a monthly basis, maybe every 6 weeks. You just take a small handful of plant food and you sprinkle it around the base of your plants. Usually like 1 handful per container is sufficient. And then you want to do that before you water. And then as you add the water mixes with the plant food and it becomes available for your plants' roots to take in. That is a secret pro tip for increasing your yields in containers, is to feed them with a dry granular plant food once a month. You could certainly use a liquid plant food as well to feed your plants. Liquid plant foods typically have a faster turnaround time on seeing results. So because it's a liquid, it's already in a form that your plants are able to take in quickly. But given that it's a liquid, it flows through the soil a lot faster. And it doesn't have that same like lingering capability as the dry food does. So if you use a liquid plant food, you probably want to feed your plants maybe once a week, every other week. All right, y'all. Well, those are the 10 tips to growing summer veggies in containers successfully. But next week's episode, I am going to be talking about one of my favorite topics. It's related to tomatoes because I just have tomatoes on the brain and you probably do too. We're going to be talking about determinate and indeterminate varieties of tomatoes in particular. We are going to talk a little bit about potato varieties as well, but we're going to be talking about determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. Maybe you have heard these terms before. Maybe you are brand new to these terms and what they could mean. But next week's episode, we're going to talk through it all and give you some tips and considerations for how you want to plan your space. Be sure to tune in for that episode. So if you have listened to this podcast in the past, then you will know that I like to sign off every episode with a fun little fact, usually not related to the content of the episode, but it's just kind of a fun, random fact about growing food. Sometimes it's about growing food. Other times it's just plant related or tangentially related to growing food, or is just something fun that I want to share with you. Today's fun fact, little tidbit, morsel of information to sign off on, is about fig trees. So fig trees are a great backyard fruit for our climate. They grow beautifully in containers, surprisingly, and in the ground. So they're great options. And the fun fact about fig trees is that figs grow on brand new growth. So as the plant is creating new branches, new leaves in the springtime, that's where on that new growth that you will get the fruit production. So typically this new growth will form on branches that are at least a year old. The figs don't typically grow on the older growth, the more mature parts of the tree, which is why pruning and tending to your fig trees, making smart cuts every year on your established fig trees. So these would be trees that are at least 3 years old, can be really helpful and help to increase your production and yields on your figs. Okay, well, that was your fun fact, and it is time for us to say goodbye for this week. But thank you so much for tuning in. Be good. Love your mother. See you next week. Thanks again for tuning into this week's episode of the Growing Space podcast. I hope that you learned something new and that you were able to take this new information home with you and implement into your growing journey and into your growing space. As always, I am here to support you in your food growing journey. If you'd like to learn more about the different services and resources and membership programs that I run through the Patio Farmer, please check out my website, thepatiofarmer.com. You can also follow me on social media. I am on Facebook, Instagram, and oh my gosh, most recently, TikTok. Wow, I know. Here I am. Patio Farmer is on TikTok. It's very exciting. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give it a like or a rating or a review if you want. Maybe share a little comment about your favorite part of the episode. Share it with a friend. The more interactions I get with my little podcast online, the more I'm able to help people just like you in their food growing journeys. As always, thanks for being here, and I will see you again next week.